He was a black billionaire, sitting quietly with his family at a corner table. They ordered with polite smiles, just looking forward to enjoying their meal. But the waitress, unimpressed and clearly biased, decided they didn't belong. What she didn't realize: this wasn't just another family she could dismiss. The truth about who they were would leave her stunned and the entire restaurant buzzing. You won't believe what happened next. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. The restaurant was one of those upscale places where people wore their best clothes and expected the best service. It had dim lighting, soft music playing, and a well-trained staff that usually catered to the city's wealthiest residents. Waiters moved quickly from table to table, their crisp white shirts and black vests pressed to perfection. On this particular day, however, there was one table that caught everyone's attention. A family of 4 had just been seated. A middle-aged black man in a tailored suit, his wife in a classy dress, and their 2 teenagers looking sharp but relaxed. They weren't loud or demanding. In fact, they seemed to blend in effortlessly. They laughed quietly as they looked over the menu, discussing their choices and chatting about their day. But something about them didn't sit well with the waitress assigned to their table. The waitress, let's call her Sarah, had been working at the restaurant for a couple of years. She was in her late 20s, known for being efficient and no-nonsense. She liked her regulars, the high-tipping businessmen, the local celebrities who walked in with an air of importance. She enjoyed being able to predict who would be worth her time and who wouldn't. And in her mind, this family wasn't worth the trouble. They weren't regulars. They didn't look familiar. And worst of all, to her, they didn't fit the image she associated with big spenders. Sarah approached the table, her notepad ready, but her tone was curt. "Have you all decided yet?" she asked, barely making eye contact. The family looked up, slightly taken aback by her brisk manner. The father smiled politely and said, "Not yet. Could we have a few more minutes?" Sarah sighed, just loud enough for them to hear. "Sure," she said. "I'll be back." As she walked away, she muttered under her breath, "Probably can't afford it anyway." Nearby, diners exchanged awkward glances. Some tried to focus on their own meals, while others couldn't help but keep an eye on the table. The family noticed too, but they chose to stay composed. They continued their conversation, their smiles unfaltering. The father reminded his son about an upcoming exam, and the mother laughed about a funny story from work. They weren't there to make a scene. They just wanted to enjoy a nice meal together. But Sarah's attitude only grew worse. When she returned to take their order, her tone was sharp, almost challenging. She didn't offer recommendations or ask how they'd like their steak cooked. Instead, she jotted down their choices with a rushed air and quickly left the table without so much as a polite "thank you." By the time the appetizers arrived, Sarah had decided she'd had enough. She approached the family once more and said, "I think it'd be better if you found another place to eat. I don't think this is the right restaurant for you." The father looked up, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Why do you say that?" he asked evenly. Sarah shrugged. "We just have a certain standard here. I think you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." A hush fell over the restaurant. The soft music continued to play, but all eyes were now on this table. Customers whispered behind their napkins, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort. The family didn't argue, didn't raise their voices. Instead, the father simply nodded. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, before we go, I'd like to speak to the manager." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. She hadn't expected that. "I don't think that's necessary," she said quickly. But the father insisted, "It won't take long. I just have a few words I'd like to share." Reluctantly, Sarah went to get the manager, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't going to end well. She glanced back at the table as she walked away, noticing that the family hadn't moved. They weren't packing up their belongings or storming out. They were sitting calmly, waiting. It unnerved her. And that's when the reality of the situation began to sink in. She didn't know who these people really were, but she was about to find out. The manager arrived at the table, straightening his tie nervously. He knew this family, even if the waitress didn't. In fact, the father was a key figure behind the scenes. His company had quietly acquired the restaurant several months ago. He preferred to keep a low profile, letting the existing staff continue their work while he focused on running the larger business empire. But now, sitting face to face with the manager, the father's calm expression made it clear that something had to change. "I understand you're the manager?" he asked politely. "Yes," the manager replied, his voice a little shaky. "How can I help you?" The father's voice stayed steady. "We came here to enjoy a meal, but instead we've been met with nothing but disrespect. I'm curious, how do you train your staff to treat customers?" The manager's eyes widened. I'm terribly sorry," he stammered. "What happened? Can you please tell me exactly what she said?" Without raising his voice, the father explained everything. He told the manager about the waitress's cold tone, her dismissive remarks, and her outright suggestion that they leave. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't need to. The truth alone was damning enough. The manager turned pale. He looked over at the waitress, who was now standing near the bar, avoiding eye contact. She had no idea who this family really was. But the manager did. He knew this was more than just a bad customer service experience. This was a serious problem that could affect everyone working there. "I assure you," the manager said quickly, "this behavior is not representative of our values. I will address this immediately." But the father wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his calm presence somehow more intimidating than if he'd been angry. "I'm not looking for a simple apology. I want to know how you'll prevent this from happening again. Not just to me, but to anyone who comes through those doors." The manager hesitated. He'd dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different. This was a wake-up call. "We will implement immediate retraining," he said, struggling to find the right words. "Cultural sensitivity training, better oversight, a stronger emphasis on respect, whatever it takes." The father nodded slowly, still watching the manager closely. "That's a start, but understand this. We will be following up to make sure it's actually done." Other diners, still listening in, began murmuring to one another. Word spread quickly through the room. This wasn't just an ordinary customer. This was someone who had the power to make changes. The waitress finally looked over, and the color drained from her face. She started to approach the table, but the manager waved her off. "I'll handle this," he said sharply. When the manager turned back, the father stood up. His family followed, calm and composed as ever. He placed a business card on the table and spoke one last time. "If you need further clarification, you can reach me directly. I expect to hear from you soon." With that, the family left. They walked out just as quietly as they had entered, leaving behind a room full of stunned customers and a staff that suddenly realized they were working for someone they had completely underestimated. The waitress, now fully aware of who she'd been dealing with, stood frozen, not knowing what to say or do. The moment the family walked out the door, the murmurs turned into a hum of conversation. "Did you hear who they are?" one diner whispered. "They own the place," another replied. It didn't take long for the entire restaurant to piece together the story. The manager, still reeling, called an emergency staff meeting as soon as the last guests left. He knew that things couldn't go back to normal. The family's visit had exposed cracks in the restaurant's culture that needed immediate attention. The waitress was reprimanded on the spot, but the manager knew that punishment alone wasn't enough. The whole team needed to change how they viewed their customers. They needed to recognize their biases, even the ones they didn't realize they had, and learn to treat every diner with the same level of respect and care. In the days that followed, the restaurant implemented new policies. Every staff member, managers included, underwent training sessions on professionalism, cultural awareness, and customer service. The goal wasn't just to avoid future incidents, but to create an environment where every guest felt welcomed and valued. The family never made a public statement about the incident. They didn't need to. The message had already been sent, and the changes were being made. The father's calm but firm approach left a lasting impression. The staff knew that their behavior mattered, not just to their boss, but to the community they served. And the diners who had witnessed the event spread the story, sharing how a single act of quiet dignity and strength had turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson that no one would soon forget. As the days passed, word began to spread among the staff about who the family really was. But it wasn't until the general manager arrived later that week, summoned from his business trip by the fallout from this incident, that the full weight of the revelation hit everyone. He gathered the staff once more and laid everything out on the table. "This family," he began, "they're not just important guests. They're not just high-profile diners. They own this restaurant. More than that, their company owns several of the top establishments in the city. And now, we've not only embarrassed ourselves in front of them, but we've also shown them a side of this team that I'm certain none of us are proud of." You could feel the tension in the room as he spoke. Sarah, in particular, was trying her best to hold it together. Her earlier apology to the manager now felt inadequate. She had been so focused on judging the family by appearances that she never considered the possibility that they might be people of significance, not just in wealth, but in character. The reality of her bias and the fallout from her actions left her visibly shaken. The general manager continued. "What's even more striking is how they chose to handle the situation. Instead of blowing up or making a public scene, they calmly walked out. They simply left their business card behind, trusting that we would figure it out ourselves. That shows more grace and patience than we probably deserve." This was the moment when the magnitude of the family's actions and their restraint really sank in. They had every right to cause a stir, to bring immediate consequences. Instead, they allowed the restaurant's leadership to take responsibility. They gave the staff a chance to correct the course. And that's exactly what began to happen. Sarah wasn't fired outright, as many had feared. Instead, she was required to attend intensive training sessions focused on cultural sensitivity, customer service, and the importance of humility. She had to confront her own assumptions, learning to treat every guest with equal respect and dignity. It wasn't easy, and there were days she struggled, but she stuck with it, determined to prove that she could change. Meanwhile, the restaurant underwent a complete overhaul in its training protocols. It wasn't just about preventing a repeat of this incident. It was about fostering a culture where every customer felt valued, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. Staff members started having open conversations about unconscious bias, sharing their own experiences and learning from one another. The ownership group, led by the family, funded these efforts, ensuring that the changes were not just surface-level adjustments, but meaningful improvements. Back at the family's headquarters, they reflected on what had transpired. They hadn't gone to the restaurant that day expecting to be treated poorly. They went as a family who wanted to enjoy a meal together, like anyone else. But the experience reminded them that even in spaces they technically owned, they weren't always seen for who they truly were. Rather than dwelling on the negative, they saw the incident as an opportunity to reshape not just one restaurant's culture, but to set an example for others. They decided to use their position as owners to influence the industry more broadly, investing in educational programs and community outreach initiatives. They made it their mission to ensure that no family, regardless of background, would ever have to face what they did. And as for Sarah, she began to turn a corner. The experience humbled her in ways she hadn't expected. She learned to listen more, to approach every customer interaction with an open mind, and to leave her assumptions at the door. She became a mentor to new hires, sharing her own story as a cautionary tale and a reminder that growth is possible when you're willing to face your mistakes head-on. The restaurant, now known for its welcoming atmosphere and exceptional service, became a shining example of what a genuine commitment to change could accomplish. Customers noticed the difference, and the story of how the family transformed the culture became an inspiring local legend. What began as a moment of disrespect and dismissal turned into something much greater. It was a lesson in grace, accountability, and the power of quiet leadership. The family didn't need to raise their voices or demand immediate retribution. They simply showed who they were, and in doing so, they changed everything. Over time, the restaurant underwent a transformation that went far beyond simple policy changes. The staff, now more aware of their own biases, began to approach every guest interaction with a renewed sense of respect. They no longer just saw customers as tables to turn, but as people with stories and experiences. The training sessions didn't just teach them how to be more polite. They taught them how to understand and appreciate diversity. And, as a result, the restaurant's reputation flourished. Sarah, the waitress at the center of it all, had her own personal journey. For the first few weeks after the incident, she struggled with guilt and self-reflection. She replayed that day in her mind, wondering how she could have been so dismissive. But as the new training sessions began and her coworkers opened up about their own blind spots, she realized she wasn't alone. Bias wasn't just her problem, it was a systemic issue that many people had, often without realizing it. She started reading books on cultural awareness and listening to podcasts about inclusion. Slowly, her perspective began to shift. She became more attentive, more thoughtful in her interactions. Over time, she went from being the employee who needed the most help to someone who supported new hires, helping them understand the importance of respect and fairness from day one. Her growth wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy, but it was genuine. Meanwhile, the family that sparked these changes watched from a distance. They never returned to the restaurant, choosing to let their actions speak for themselves. But behind the scenes, they supported the restaurant's efforts, funding continued training programs and even hosting community events at other locations. They saw what happened as a chance to create a ripple effect, not just for that one restaurant, but for the hospitality industry as a whole. They didn't want to be seen as victims or heroes. They just wanted to ensure that their experience would help others. For them, the real success was hearing from other patrons who felt welcomed and respected. They knew that their quiet response to the incident had led to meaningful change, and that was all they had ever hoped for. The general manager, too, reflected on how this event had reshaped his own leadership style. He no longer saw cultural sensitivity training as just a box to check. It became a central part of his management philosophy. He encouraged open dialogue among his staff, held regular workshops, and even brought in guest speakers to share their perspectives. He realized that a great restaurant wasn't just about the food or the ambiance. It was about the people, both the guests and the staff, feeling valued and respected. As the years went on, the story of what happened at the restaurant became more than just a local tale. Other establishments took notice, adopting similar training programs and changing how they approached customer service. The family's decision not to retaliate with anger, but to lead with quiet dignity, became a model for handling conflict. Their approach showed that even the most upsetting situations could lead to positive outcomes if handled with patience and grace. Sarah often shared her story with new coworkers, not to dwell on her mistake, but to show that it's never too late to grow. She wanted others to see that acknowledging bias wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was the first step toward becoming a better person. By being honest about her journey, she inspired others to be more reflective, more open-minded, and more compassionate. The restaurant eventually became known as one of the most welcoming places in the city. Customers returned not just for the food, but for the warm, inclusive environment. The staff took pride in their work, knowing that they were part of a team that truly cared about every guest's experience. And for the family who had once been asked to leave, this change was the best possible outcome. They didn't need an apology or a grand gesture. The lasting improvement in how the restaurant treated all its guests was the only resolution they wanted. Looking back, it was clear that this incident wasn't just about one waitress's behavior. It was about challenging assumptions, confronting biases, and proving that change is possible. What began as a moment of disrespect turned into a catalyst for growth, understanding, and ultimately, a more inclusive community. So, what can we take away from this story? Sometimes the most powerful response isn't loud or aggressive. It's dignified, calm, and focused on making meaningful change. This family could have reacted in so many different ways, but by standing their ground respectfully, they were able to turn a negative moment into a powerful lesson for everyone involved. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone's actions completely change the atmosphere in a room? What did you learn from it? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. We're grateful to have you here, and we look forward to bringing you more stories that inspire and spark change. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.